interested in this field. So think about, I mean, the first natural person to go would be the chair, but if the chair cannot or is not interested in going, then you could have a discussion at a future meeting about how you might select. We have two students here from the Berkeley High School's Law and Social Justice class. And they are filming part of the meeting tonight as part of a project for their class. And, welcome. And I'm going to be on vacation May 17th to 25th. Byron will be in my absence and cheerfully sitting in on your staffing your next PRC meeting in 2 weeks. And that's it for my report.
I'm going to forego the usual topics in the report so that we can get right to CPE. I do want to say that our department's engagement with CPE started several years ago. The Center for Policing Equity, its focus is on just that, achieving equity in policing, which one aspect of that is to take every area where there may not be equity and where the police have the ability as agents in that to learn and have some control over what the outcomes are, to learn about those and think of ways forward towards achieving equity and fairness in policing in the service of community trust. And for us, that means the initial step that we just give CPE data and look forward to how they analyze it and for their recommendations to help inform how we move forward. For many of you who I know are following these issues very closely, I want to highlight that I know the PRC has its own report with its recommendations, and our intention is to hear CPE tonight and then moving forward look at those recommendations, the recommendations that flowed out of the PRC's work and their recommendations, and some of our own ideas that we're going to bring to that. So that's a broad level of how we see ourselves looking forward, and I just kind of want to make it clear what we've done is just said we will give you all the data that we can so that we can support not only equity in policing for us and our community, but also support the national conversation about how to engage in the science of justice, which means how to collect data from 18,000 different law enforcement agencies who are gathering data in different ways or use different systems, and how to build an analytical framework to move towards comparative analysis as well. So really understand what's going on. So I don't want to steal CPE thunder, but we, from the beginning, wanted to be contributors to that effort and that conversation by way of, in this first instance, providing data, having what I hope will be a long-term engagement with CPE, so we have sort of annual reports from them, and in constructively contributing to the discussion, because it is a nuanced and complex one. The data, the types of data, and what to do with the data are not, those issues are not resolved by any means, but it's exciting to be part of that discussion. And so I just want to give that as a sort of intro and some context for why we're here. And with that, I'll introduce the folks from CPE who are.
So, actually, we had one item of business,
Go
which is
ahead.
to elect a vice chairperson. The PRC needs to take care of, and then we'll turn it
Go
over.
ahead.
So that was actually your chief's, your
It's all good.
regular.
Let's have an election.
So, very quickly, do we have any nominations for vice chair? Yes.
I would like to nominate George to become the vice chair.
Do you accept your nomination?
Is there a second?
Oh,
Second.
I'll accept it.
Are there any more nominations at this time? Any discussion? All right, Ms. Lee, would you please take roll?
Yes. Allenby?
Brenda.
Alameda?
Oh, yes.
Matthews?
Yes.
Harris Villas?
Yes.
Pritchett?
Yes.
Ramsey?
Yes.
Legg?
Yes.
Ritchie?
Yes.
And Lacey?
Yes.
Okay. Commissioner Perez Villas, our vice chair.
All right, congratulations to our new vice chair and acting chair for the next 5 meetings.
Bam! That's the second setup she does for me, for the record. Monday was the first setup.
All right, moving on to new business, we can now start our presentation by
I'll just introduce Krista Dunn, who's our project manager. I'll let you do more introductions. Kimberly Burke was our primary presenter. Chris Burbank, retired chief of Salt Lake City and the vice president of CPEs.
One of the vice presidents, yes.
And Jack Laser, professor at Cal, author of recent book Suspect Race. If you really want to get into it, it's available on Amazon. So I yield the floor.
He can't plug your book like that. If you don't mind, I'm going to stand up. As was said, my name is Chris Burbank. I was police chief in Salt Lake City for 9 years. I have been with CPE for about 13 years now. Since its inception, when Phil Goff, our founder, sitting at a kitchen table with Tracy Cassie, a co-founder, decided that they wanted to do some work in policing. Both of them have PhDs in psychology and done a lot of work in racial profiling, bias in systems, implicit bias, and they wanted to see how it impacted policing and how they could change the outcome of policing. Let me first start by saying that what all of you do is significant. I know sometimes it doesn't, and George, I'm really glad you voted for yourself. I know how hard it is to commit your time to come out and do this, but it is one of the most important things that you can do for the police department, for the well-being of your community, for those people that you represent, right? To participate in this system is crucial. Let me tell you a little about CPE. The chief certainly did a good job introducing us. In fact, we ought to send more people to our conference so we can have disciples that run around and talk good things about CPE. The goal of our organization is to eliminate bias in policing. And the challenge that we have in putting that forward is the fact that bias exists everywhere in the nation. And police departments are microcosms of the societies that they serve. It would be wonderful if we could draw police officers from this nice little island somewhere that they have no negative interactions, they have no preconceived notions, and they have not grown up with bias in their lives. But unfortunately, we cannot. And so what we try and do is eliminate, through the process to hire people, as much of that exists in the person, or at least to confirm that they're not going to express that when they interact with the public. By the use of a consent search, we are woefully inadequate at answering that question. And that is a violation, potentially, or an infringement on an individual's civil rights, on what is enumerated in the Constitution. And yet we are woefully unprepared to answer those questions. And then even, which is an insult to my former profession, to be able to answer the question, well, how many times did we shoot and kill an individual in this country last year? And so about, 7 years ago, maybe, Jack, we started down the road of trying to develop a national database to look at all those things within policing that were not being answered anywhere else. And we have done a pretty good job of influencing individual agencies. We've tried to do some national lobbying, I guess, or certainly as a nonprofit, we're not into lobbying, but trying to convince people that the avenue to actually create trust. Because what we're experiencing in policing is a crisis of legitimacy. We have an outcome that we don't like. Right? We have an outcome that has bias in it. We know the outcome of the criminal justice system has disparity. But now the question becomes, what is the cause of that disparity? And what is the contribution of the front end of that system in law enforcement? And also a big question is, what is the influence of the community? Because most of this is wrapped up in community expectation. When we wander down the road of saying we need to have heavy enforcement, we need to have zero tolerance, we need to, it takes on stop and frisk, it's cops on dots, there's a lot. Does poverty precede participation in the criminal justice system? Does education or lack of education? Should we do consent searches? Should we do traffic stops? Should we write tickets? Now, all of those have consequence to the action. In fact, there were a good number of people at our convening that said we should have no policing whatsoever, that should go away. And certainly that's an option, but there are significant consequences from that. And those are informed decisions that we hope we can help to inform that decision a little bit as you make going forward and what works best. for your community and the interactions that you have with law enforcement. Because we should always, always hold our law enforcement officers to the very highest standard. But I personally think that goes for everyone in the community. And so what we hope to present to you today is a middle road, right? Here's what it looks like. Here are some of the things. Here's what you should gather. But one of the most important things is we want to come back a year from now and look at all the wonderful things that you all got together on this is how we do business and how that has reached the body officially as a city. How that has changed the outcome of policing. I've had a very fortunate career to travel the world and interact not only with lots of police officers, but with lots of advocacy and community groups. In the middle is the reason, in the middle is where the discussion, the compromise should take place, and the discussion of outcome and what. So with that, I'm going to turn, are we going to Kristen next? We're going to give her a chance to talk for a minute.
Just started a trend, so I stand as well. My name is Krista Dunn. I am the project manager, director of the National Justice Database. I'm also the liaison with the law enforcement agencies. And at the time, for whatever reason, I'm not sure whether it was what was available, but at the time we were, our MOU with Berkeley PD, but a limited amount of data would be given to the center to do analysis. We started to collect that data. It was very limited data, but I will say I work with just under 200 agencies across the country. We work with only agencies that really want to work with us. They are courageous chiefs that come and work with us because they're coming to an independent organization. And the very first words I say to a chief who wants to work with us is, we are going to find disparity, probably a lot of it in your agency. Do you want to still do this? And every one of them that we're working with has said absolutely yes. And about the first week you were the chief, I think it was, Chief Greenwood called me and said, we want to continue this relationship with the Center for Policing Equity, but instead of giving partial data, we want to open our data to you to get everything that you are asking for that we can possibly give you. Now I say that because we've not found an agency that gives all the data that we're looking for, but they literally opened their data to us. My team was able to work directly, and I have to thank his crime analyst people, his internal affairs folks, Steve Rego. They really have provided everything for us. They've answered all of our questions and spent a lot of hours doing such. So I want to thank them, but I also want to thank Chief Greenwood. I've been the liaison. I think he probably met these folks the first time last week. Yeah, okay. And so it's a courageous thing to step in and say, okay, we're yours. Tell us tell us where we're making mistakes. So I want to thank you and your team for allowing us to do that, because it is tough to open yourself up to let people criticize you. And so he's done that graciously, and he's done that open-mindedly, saying, go ahead and tell us what you need to tell us. So with that, I'll turn the rest of the time over to Kim.
Thank you. I'm going to break with the trend of my teammates and not stand up because I'm the one going through a 57-page report. I feel justified. So before I get into it, I just want to kind of give everyone the layout. I am trying to make it through a 57-page report. I think I can do it in about 30 minutes. But I want to leave room after each table, after each graph, for questions, for comments, for discussion. This really is a collaborative process. We want feedback. There's room for change in our next round of analyses. So everything that you have to say or that you're thinking is valuable for us. So I'll do a little pause after each presentation so that you have a space to really ask your questions, and that's really why the CPE team is here right now. We also have one of the principal investigators on the National Justice Database up here. So he's a great guy to field all of your stats questions. So let's get into it. Can everyone see the screen okay? We spent a lot of time setting this up, so please just okay. All right, thank you. It's very even too. So first of all, the National Justice Database Analytic Framework tries to distinguish between three broad types of explanations for racial disparities in policing outcomes. Any or all of which can play a part in producing racial disparities here in Berkeley, but also in every agency we've ever gotten data from. So the first type are disparities that arise from community characteristics. These could be crime rates, high poverty rates, and more recently we're seeing an increased need to really focus on bias in the communities via calls for service that can contribute to some of the disparities we're seeing in officer-civilian interactions. The second broad type is police characteristics. This could mean police deployment. If there's a greater deployment in certain areas, spots that are leading to increased interactions, that could contribute to some disparities. If police are given certain directives, for example, that's another broad type that we would consider a police characteristic. And then finally are the relationships between communities and police officers. What do I mean? So some communities have less trust in law enforcement, which could lead to them fleeing upon seeing an officer approaching. It might also contribute to resisting arrest, more so than in other communities. So these kinds of things play a role in disparities as well. And overall, what we're hoping to do, like Chris said so eloquently, is really just create a roadmap to better understand the disparities that we're seeing. So which direction we go, all of that is why we're here right now, why we're working continually with BPD to really shape what that looks like. And this is really just the beginning of an ongoing, like I said, chart to get to better and more just outcomes. Questions about the framework? No. All right. So the data that we collected and analyzed that's represented in this report spans from January 1st, 2012 through December 31st, 2016. We had over 40,500 vehicle stops represented, over 3,000 pedestrian stops, 174 use of force incidents. 14 of those are not included in the data because they were missing race or they couldn't be geocoded or they 2 were outside of Berkeley. And then last, the crime report data, so over 400,000 crimes reported. I do want to make a note before I get into the graphs marking disparities about population benchmarks and really what disparities mean. So some of the analyses are benchmarked on census population data. We know that not a product of racial bias, and that's not always the case, and that's something that we're trying to parse out in our analyses. And again, as Chris said, there are disparities in every institution and all contexts of the US, so it is completely reasonable that we should expect to see disparities in policing outcomes as well. And I think it bears repeating, as our president said in front of a national conference, that Berkeley PD has fewer disparities than any of the 240 police departments that he's seen through the National Justice Database stops, and they're either white or black drivers. The stops of Hispanic, Asian American, and the racial group other are 13%, 9%, and 10% respectively. And those are the 3 bottom lines. It is a bit hard to distinguish between the 2 blues. So Asian American is the light blue at the very bottom, and then the darker blue is the 33% white drivers. And you can also see just an upward trend generally across this time period, so the number of vehicle stops increased for every racial group in this period. This percentage of stops that resulted in arrest broken down by race. So we see that 1.2% of white drivers who were stopped by BPD were arrested. Asian Americans were arrested at 2.9%. Hispanic was 2.1, and black drivers were 1.9, and the other racial category was 0.9%. So the least likely to be arrested at a vehicle stop.
Kim, if I could just make a comment at this point. I would caution against making any inferences about what these particular disproportions might represent. It's very difficult. This one of the purposes of the National Justice Database is to triangulate on the best methods for analyzing these kinds of data to determine whether or not we can attribute some of these disparities to racial bias, either in individual officer decision-making or deployment decisions, or if it's really attributable to different behavioral patterns. And because the data are incomplete, all we have here are the data of the recorded stops and the arrests that result from those. We can't really make a very clear inference about whether these differences in these numbers represent actual disparities. These are just the numbers, and this is the first pass. And you'll see that we're gonna cut the numbers different ways so that we can start to make better inferences. But we want to be really careful not to go too far with any one graph or any one set of numbers.
So in cutting the numbers in a different way, this graph displays the number of stops resulting in arrest based on the population, so per 1,000 residents of the same racial category. So these rates were calculated by dividing the number of vehicle stops by census estimates of the number of Berkeley residents of the same racial group at that same time period. So on a per capita basis, black and Hispanic drivers were more likely to be arrested at a vehicle stop than white drivers were. These disparities were evident in every year of the observation period, and they increased over time, which you can see on the graph. By 2016, compared to their share of the Berkeley population, black people were more than 13 times likely per capita than whites to be arrested at a vehicle stop, and Hispanic drivers were nearly 4 times as likely. This next chart displays the percentage of stops that involved a search, again, across race of the driver. So compared to white drivers, 5.3% of whom were searched at a vehicle stop, black and Hispanic drivers were much more likely to be searched. Stopped black drivers were nearly 4 times more likely to be searched than white drivers, and stopped Hispanic drivers were more than 3 times as likely to be searched than white drivers. The search rates for stopped Asian American and the other racial category were similar to those stopped for white drivers. So now let's look at vehicle stops resulting in a search benchmarked against the population, so the per capita again. Again, these were calculated by dividing the number of vehicle stops by census estimates of the number of Berkeley residents of the same race at the same time. So on a per capita basis, black and Hispanic drivers were much more likely to be searched at a vehicle stop than white drivers per capita. Hispanic drivers were searched at vehicle stops 4 times more often than white drivers, and black drivers were searched at nearly 20 times the per capita rate of white drivers. And these disparities were apparent in every year of the observation, and they increased over time. So the final graph on vehicle stops displays the number of stops resulting in a search by race and age group. Here we see within every racial group, drivers under 18 were more likely to be searched, and the likelihood of a search decreased with age. There was a large black-white disparity across age groups, such that the oldest black driver was more likely to be searched than any age group of white drivers. For example, 16% of over over 40 black drivers were searched compared to only 12% of under 18 aged white drivers. Black drivers under the age of 18 were 2.4 times more likely to be searched than white drivers of the same age. We see a nearly identical trend in the Hispanic-white disparity for the youngest of drivers, that 18 and under category. Now moving on to pedestrian stops. This graph.
Just one quick question. Are these searches of persons or searches of cars?
Searches of vehicles is my assumption.
Yes, so on the vehicle stops, which one of the things that would be good to differentiate is, was that found on the person as a result of the vehicle stop, or was it found in the car?
Right, I think the data, and Rita, if I get it wrong, please let me know. I think the data indicate where an officer says a search occurred, but it's not specified as the search was of the person or of the vehicle.
We just know it's a result of a vehicle stop.
That's correct. They weren't able to differentiate that.
For the per capita, did you sort out out-of-town people from in-town people? Like, was it higher for black residents of Berkeley versus white residents of Berkeley? Or was it higher for people from out of the community coming in? Do we know the answer?
So the benchmark is on Berkeley residents, but we don't know the residential status of the person stopped. And so that's one of the areas that is probably one of the
Much of these very things that we're talking about are things that are not included in the report information or data right now.
Alright, so the data we collect for car stops, which is I think 6 fields of data that we collect for car stops, doesn't include residency either way. So it doesn't include, it wasn't available for analysis. But we recognize it's an issue.
If the stop doesn't result in a citation or arrest, we don't particularly want to be collecting the residency of the person. That's an invasion of their privacy. So that's one of the challenges of, and when I say we, I mean people who study these kinds of data. One of the challenges of doing this is getting a sense of who is in the denominator of those who are being stopped. And when we set out to establish this national database, we thought we were going to try to figure out the denominator. We realized we didn't even have a good enumerator. We didn't even realize who was getting stopped in the first place. And so that's challenging enough as it is. But these are exactly the right questions. What is one denominator is who is the pool of people who we expect the Berkeley Police Department to be stopping at any given time. And it's going to invariably be people from outside of the community included. And the best available denominator we have is who lives in Berkeley, but it's imperfect, and it's a work in progress.
And if I may just so the graph that just talked about the raw numbers of searches that take place, that's partly why we do both types of analyses, so that you can look and say, well, those are just strictly raw numbers, and this is what it represents. And then ultimately, we're going to look a little bit at how effective that is. Please.
In addition to the distinction between searches of persons and searches of vehicles, is there a data breakdown on the invasiveness of the searches? So a Terry stop versus a consent search versus an incident to arrest? Or is that just all lumped together? So.
Yeah, I don't recall. I don't recall.
My memory is that they are all lumped together because it's not differentiated in the data that we receive.
Which is one of the things that's very important as we look forward. As we said, 240 agencies that we now have started to do analyses on. And you look and you say, okay, are consent searches leading to more disparity than, say, probable cause sort of circumstances, or search incidents to arrest? And so that's where across the nation we need to do a much better job to differentiate why exactly is it a law enforcement officer? Because if we're going to make decisions, right, maybe we make everyone sign a consent form. I mean, those are the types of things that we want to have some good, strong data to support our decision that is going to impact our community and how law enforcement interacts with members of it.
But wouldn't that be then an end result of whether whoever's getting stopped is not aware of the difference between the consensual and non-consensual stop? And at the same time, because maybe their understanding of what their rights are when they're getting stopped, or when they are getting seized, whether they're getting stopped and searched, then the other dynamic would be a recommendation on what to do to inform the community, which the ACLU already does. But I want to do a question which based on the first statement behind me. This is not an evaluation of jurisdiction of where people live, or whether they're registered to vote, or what county they live. This is pretty much an interpretation of what the racial makeup of that person was. Is that correct? Great.
But the disparities that you're talking about are all based on population, which I guess I'm struggling to understand. I understand you're saying that's all you have, but I mean, in Berkeley, I don't know if this is the case other places, but most of the arrests and a huge number of the car stops are people from outside the city. So I'm trying to understand why the population data talking about disparities is even legitimate. But how do you know that? How do you know that they're out of town? Well, the arrests, I see them. I mean, I haven't.
Anecdotally, but do you have to go through and access the statistics?
Well, it is an anecdotal question. I'm saying, when I listen to the scanner all the time, it's usually someone else personally. I'm just curious if it's, I think it bears further, we need more data.
Sure, I think that's in the report.
But I'm trying to understand why population is even viewed. I just think it's gonna lead to so much confusion.
So, we don't disagree, and that's why we try and look at it at different angles. And there's certainly, when you look, there's several studies that talk about where crime is being committed and who are the victims and perpetrators of crime. Now, not our work, but other people's work. And that most criminals are committing crime within their own neighborhood, are not transitory in nature and moving, especially across county lines or city lines, that most crime is local. And that's one of the arguments that's made. Again, we have as much information as we can have access to to benchmark it. Ideally, right, in order to get at this number, you would know the identity of every single driver on the road, right, at any given time within your city streets, and then who that stop is. Now, love to be able to do that research, but there's no way to get to it. And so we have to make some inferences that, again, when you look at other data as far as just the raw numbers, we have to ask ourselves the question, right? Are there things that we can do different in order to bring that disparity down? And why does that disparity exist? Right? Is it the perception of the law enforcement officer of the individual, or is it the observation that they make about behavior that drives searches? So we got a couple questions. Let me go, gentleman in blue, and then I'll come back up.
Point of order, just with respect to public comment or non-public comment.
My understanding was that there's like an open
We suspend the rules. I move that we suspend the rules.
Okay, second.
We
I don't
are.
know what the rules are.
Yeah. We probably violated.
I probably said that for a rule violation. I also just want to circle back to Jack's point that these are descriptives. We hear your problem with the population benchmarking, short of having someone survey the traffic to actually see who's driving all of the cars. If you have millions of dollars, let's please do that. There are different sets of analyses that we're going to be getting to that might be more fruitful. So if there are further questions about the per capita, we hear you. We're all the way there. If you have some other suggestions.
Let me just add that.
I have another question about what Jack just said. Is there any data about what a person who was stopped for a traffic stop got arrested for? I mean, what was the content of these arrests, and why were there arrests if it's simply a traffic stop in general? But how does that factor in?
My understanding is this is something we need to work with BPD about for going forward, because we would like to differentiate much more among those. At this point, we have arrest, citation, no action.
We don't have any data in here on that.
Right. I just, I just want to add, so I received this report Thursday or Friday, and shared it out with the department. We had some discussion, and so in that discussion about the denominator, I'm just going to share it, and not just because it's sort of being asked. So in terms of arrests, we just ran arrest and ticket data to see where people said they lived, and so from 2012 to 2017 for arrests, 30% of the arrests were people giving a Berkeley address, 28% were arrests of people who gave no address, and 41% were arrests of people who gave addresses outside of Berkeley.
If I can interrupt and just be a parliamentarian, there was a motion to suspend the rules. I don't know if there was a second, but I'm not sure whether there was a vote. And I would just caveat the commission to understand that there has to be some control even to suspend the rules. So I would recommend the chair to have a control of how many speakers every single time to create a flow, not to circumvent or to stop communications. But there hasn't been a vote, even though there was a motion on the floor and a second. So I would request there will be a vote so that we can just have it in the record for the PRC officer.
So, if I can add to that, when we suspend the rules, if I can ask our presenter to call on people and to wait until you're called on to speak, if that's all right. And that if you have more that you want to get to, or you think that questions will be addressed later in the presentation, you can continue on and I'll answer all the questions.
Happy to do that. Yeah.
Okay, so we do have to take a vote. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, so we can continue. Thank you.
I'll just kind of.
Can you say those numbers again?
Yeah. So for arrests from 2012 to 2017, 30% Berkeley address, 28% no home address, and 41% an address outside of Berkeley. For tickets in the same time range, 2012 to 17, there's citations, and I believe this is probably moving citations primarily, so traffic tickets that are given. 32% with a Berkeley address, unknown address for 5%, no home address for 9%, and 54% for people outside of Berkeley. I don't give this data to be defensive, but it's obviously generating like, oh, how can we really try to get more and more at what the issues are and better understand the information? That's just an example of it, and I just wanted to sort of share that out.
Thank
briefly.
you.
But in the spirit of constructive, like, there are things we can look at.
Yeah. The rules that have now been appointed to uphold hands, and then I will call you, sir, and then.
So for vehicle, pedestrian, or arrest stats, is there a slide that shows which ones were related to investigation, where somebody's calling in, or an on view versus just like a traffic violation?
So you officer initiated versus calls for service.
Right.
So that's something we weren't able to parse out in the data, and you'll read that in the report as well. That's an area that is great
Just
for
missing
further
data.
investigation. Yeah.
Another
Yes.
bit of data that might be missing, but I think would be interesting, is to understand how many, I said another piece of data that might be missing, but that I think would be interesting to know is how many searches were parole or probation searches.
Yes. Yeah. So that is a big missing part of it. People with outstanding warrants contributing to the arrest.
And not just standing warrants, but just searches pursuant to the conditions of someone's probation or parole.
A hand here.
Since you have the geocode, are you able to distinguish a stop on a major artery such as Ashby Avenue outside versus Ellis Street also outside? The idea being highway versus neighborhood.
Yes. So we do get to where we link it to census tract neighborhood data.
Well, I'm speaking specifically about a road, so we're talking about traffic searches on a highway situation versus on a neighborhood street situation.
I mean, what we're doing, we're working on those analyses at the aggregate level. We're compiling multiple departments so that we have sufficient statistical power to figure out how to do that right. But we're not ready to apply that at the individual city level yet. But that's a really good insight. We're working on that because we think that traffic corridors really explain a lot of what's going on.
Just as a follow-up, also time of day.
And day of week, yeah. No, I mean, commuters are gonna be a big factor in this, and yeah, and we're on that, but it's gonna take some more time before we're ready to apply that at the city level.
Thank you.
Can we have dim lit lights?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's getting pretty dark.
Either turn the lights on or dim them or.
Okay.
And also, while we're doing that, can I just add, population benchmarks in research on racial disparities in anything, but particularly in policing, population benchmarks are the crudest possible benchmark. We do not place a lot of confidence in population benchmarks, and that's why it might actually be good at this point to start moving through some of the other analyses, because you can make much stronger inferences looking at the search rate per stops and the arrest rates per searches. You can start to make, because there you actually have a denominator, but the population benchmark as a denominator is really flawed. But I would suggest that we can actually move forward.
Yes. All right. So at Jack's suggestion, moving forward. So this is about the interpretation of the disparities in vehicle and pedestrian stops. So a standard way to examine disparities is through yield rate analyses. This is the idea that if members of different racial groups are subjected to equal levels of suspicion and equivalent treatment, then the stops, which would be the denominator, members of different groups, of each group would be equally likely to uncover illegal activity, and that would be the numerator. But on the other hand, if one group was more likely to be stopped at lower levels of suspiciousness, the yield rate for this group would be lower. So the numerator would be smaller, but the denominator would be much bigger. In our report, we weren't able to collect data, or the department doesn't collect data on contraband uncovered. So we use arrest rates as a proxy for yield rate. This is less than ideal for two reasons that I want to point out. It assumes that an officer is going to make an arrest anytime that they uncover evidence of illegal activity. This is not how officers patrol or make decisions, discretionary decisions, so that's unrealistic. It also doesn't take into account, someone was pointing out earlier, that someone could be arrested unrelated to a stop, like an outstanding warrant. So, that said, this graph shows the percentage of persons who are arrested, and among those, the percentage of persons who are arrested among those stopped and searched by BPD. Does that make sense? So I'm not going to say yield rate because it's not yield rate. It's of those stopped and searched, those that were arrested. Okay. So overall, 20% of white people who were searched by BPD were arrested. This was a higher arrest rate after search compared to Black and Hispanic people, who were at 12% and 10% respectively. That is, searches of Black and Hispanic individuals were less productive at uncovering criminal behavior, according to this. Searches of Black individuals were only half as likely as searches of whites to yield an arrest, and searches of Hispanic individuals were 39% less likely to yield an arrest. Arrest rates were higher among Asian Americans searched by BPD, so at 24%. Asian American drivers and pedestrians were much less likely than other groups to be stopped or searched, but once they were searched, they were arrested at higher rates. Ultimately, we're left with more questions that you'll see here. So, if white drivers were stopped and searched at rates as high as those experienced by Black and Hispanic drivers, would their arrest rates increase? If Black and Hispanic drivers were searched at a level of suspicion as high, that is as infrequently as white and Asian American drivers, would a higher percentage of those searches reveal criminal wrongdoing? So again, these are promising areas for further investigation. So now I will turn to the use of force data. Again, referring to the explicit policy, and Chief, correct me if I'm wrong, incidents of hands-on force not involving a weapon may not be comprehensively reported or tracked by BPD and may not be fully reflected in the data presented in this section of our report. So I also want to note that there were multiple types of force reported used on a person during the same incident. So when that was the case, or when multiple officers reported using the same type of force during the same incident, our analysis counts that event as a single incident, and we classify it according to the most severe force type that was used.
I just want to say, so force is reported by officers. Force is reported when a weapon is used, essentially when a weapon is used, or when it's physical force where there's a visible injury, or where the person upon whom the force was used complains of injury, even if no injury is visible. So that's the specific term.
That's what it
force.
was.
That's what it is now. And there's we're going to we're working on redoing that and broadening it, but that's the force policy.
The ways that police departments report force is remarkably variable. We've done comparative analyses across multiple departments, and this is one of our biggest challenges, is finding a way to harmonize data across different departments, because you can just be amazed that some departments with 4 categories of force, some departments with 20 categories of force. Just the continua are generally the same from mild to lethal, but they vary in how they parse it, and that's something we're working on. And we're glad to hear that Berkeley is going to work with us on that.
Was the use of tear gas accounted for?
Yes, we have those used.
No, tear gas.
Tear gas.
That's a crowd situation.
Yes, it is.
That's not.
So
That
if
was
you,
one of the categories that was listed.
Yes.
One of the categories of which we obtained data.
But
how did you get data if it wasn't recorded?
If you're referring to 2014,
At least, yeah.
If you're referring to 2014, that's not reported in terms of the use of force. These are the individual uses of force reported by.
So it's
policy.
individual but not crowd.
Right.
And second question, I thought as a result of the lawsuit that happened related to 2014, that the use of force reporting requirements were going to be changed to include any use of force, whether it's hands or weapons or any kind of use of force.
I guess there's more to it than I hesitate about taking time. The lawsuit settlement is such that we agreed and have implemented in policy that officers that use force in the midst of a crowd situation do their best to document that as a supplemental to their police report, which is, so they're reporting where the force was used to the best of their ability, given often very dynamic and very long incidents, which is separate from the use of force reporting, where we have individual use of force in the incident isolated in and of itself, which generates the use of force reports. That when we say use of force reports, that's what we're talking about.
So at this point, subsequent to the settlement, in an individual situation, would we expect that if an officer used physically restrained or used pain compliance or that kind of thing, that would be considered a use of force at this point?
It would generate
going forward from here.
It would generate a use of force report if the person had a visible injury or complained of pain. So there could be a scenario where the officer uses a control hold or a restraint hold, using force to overcome resistance to make an arrest, and the person doesn't complain, and there's no visible injury. So that incident would not result in the use of force, and that's where we're going with our policy, which will be to broaden it. So anytime we are overcoming physical resistance, we're actually generating a use of force report. So given that in the use of force reports that we've generated, I expect that category will increase, the physical force. But so you'll see a higher number there, and that'll be force used to overcome resistance.
If I might just help there, Commissioner, and there was a subcommittee that dealt with the use of force changes to be a little bit more of any use of force, and subsequently as well to deal with whatever incremental uses of force are, whether it was a control hold, and that's one use of force, whether it was a dynamic takedown, that's a second use of force. So that's coming out through the pipeline as well. And in the first 1 or 2 pages here, there's a recommendation that all uses of force, regardless of whether the result of injury, critical or otherwise, or a complaint of pain, compliance or not compliance, be also taken into consideration in the reporting scheme. So we're going towards that, so that might change the dynamic of how this is reported. So that's on the works.
Have you assessed departments anywhere across the country for how forthcoming they are for reporting use of force, or for whether it matches the level of use of force reported by the community. Do you measure that? So you could tell, for example, how forthcoming a department is relative to other departments.
So what we use to measure that, because it's a very difficult number to get at. I mean, we have done community surveys in some communities where you take feedback, but you can't, it's very difficult to match those with individual time and place, unless you're doing a very extensive study. So what we use is comparisons across agencies as to size, population, crime rate. Are those similar, right? Or are there huge disparities in what those reportings are? And then in that case, I mean, we've actually said this to agencies, it appears, right, and we can't know this for sure, but it appears you might be underreporting this because by comparison with everyone else in the country of your size, right, you have much fewer. And so those are the types of things that we look at, but we don't have an exact number to say, yes, you're absolutely not. So we would make inference that, boy, it's something you need to look at, and in this case, our recommendation is, boy, we want to see more of any time that you use any type of force should be captured and recorded. And then you come up with a better number or analysis there. Does that make sense? I hope?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So this next graph displays the number of force incidents reported, benchmarked again against the resident population by race. Why do I go back to the per capita graph, actually? But I've started, so I'm going to keep going. So BPD reported 8 uses of hands-on force per white person for every, this is benchmark, or per 10,000 white residents of Berkeley. For every 10,000 black residents of Berkeley, there were 73 uses of hands-on force, about 9.1 times higher than that for white individuals. Rates of baton use were 6.4 times greater, and OC spray was 5.3 times greater in the black-white disparity. Moving on. So, interpreting the disparities that we observed and the use of force. So using data from the decennial census in the American Community Survey, we were able to ascertain demographic information about the census tract in which each stop or incident took place. So BPD shared data on all arrests made, and that included geographic location, which enabled us to match on the number of Part 1 crimes reported in each census tract for that same period. Part 1 crime, for those who haven't memorized the UCR, is the 8 types of crime: criminal homicide, forcible rape, sexual assault, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, theft. We are also able to link to poverty rates in that neighborhood. And so our regression analyses are benchmarked or controlled for those kinds of variables, which we'll move into. We were later in discussing, talking about the ability to figure out the residency status of the subject in the use of force incident, in which case we would be able to remove in future analyses non-Berkeley residents to compare and control based on those solely in Berkeley. So that is not in this data, and you'll also see that because of the small sample sizes of Asian American, Hispanic, and other racial categories represented, we collapse those to be able to have statistically significant findings. So here, the first model finds that controlling for variation in use of force incidents accounted for by members of different racial groups residing in the same census tract. The black resident population experienced about 10.8 times the use of force incident rate as that of white residents. And this model, those p-values are how significant or how much variation that explains in the model. So the model explains at least 99% of variation. As we... No?
Take that back.
Take that back. Okay.
It just means that
it's statistically significant at a level of confidence of 99%. But yes.
Take it from the stats professor and not the sociology graduate. So our second model, it's kind of cut off, but that is controlling for the number of Part 1 crimes. And it does explain some of the disparities that we saw in the first model. So when we control for that, the likelihood that the Black resident is experiencing disparate rates of force goes down to about 10.5. The same is true when we control in the second model for the rate of poverty. And you'll see that it is one standard deviation over the poverty level, and I think that was, how do I scroll down? It basically is giving us a very conservative estimate. So whatever the poverty level was, it's going to be even more conservative than that. So our model is showing that that does explain again for some of the disparity we see in these racial categories. Model number 4 then is looking at the neighborhood population data. And so when we controlled for that, we see that disparity actually go up to about 12.3 times more likely. And then in the very last model, we've included all of the controls. So Part 1 crime data, the poverty level, and the percent of the neighborhood population that is of that racial category. And that disparity goes up to 12.6. Question.
What does it mean when you say that poverty explains some of the?
So when you hold, and I'm going to defer to Jack, but when you hold poverty constant, so then it's not accounting for any of the variation, then we can see what role race is playing more effectively.
So you compare people at the same income level across the board. Is that what you mean?
Essentially, yes. Yes.
In the draft report that preceded this one, so the spring 2017 draft, you had some discussion of the multicollinearity among the variables that you ended up using, which is a jargon way of saying that Black people tend to be poor people. Mm-hmm. And so when you measure those two things, you may be overweighting that phenomenon. So the question I have is, the number that you got comparable to the 12.6 was about half that size. It was 6 times more likely that that a Black person would have use of force made against him. My question is, what caused the 6 to rise to 12? Was it simply better data, or a different modeling technique, or something else?
I think that it's just accounted for in the breadth of data that we collected. But to an issue that I meant to raise, you'll see that in our model 3, that the poverty level no longer becomes significant when we control for Part 1 crime data and neighborhood race demographics as well, because of the issue that you just mentioned, that poverty is often, race is a proxy for poverty. So.
I mean, 6 or 12, neither number is good. But I'm not trying to split a hair there. What I'd like to know is just, was there something big that changed?
So we need to get you a good answer on that. That's a question that we're just looking at each other, okay, so we'll get back to the chief on that, because that's an interesting question you raised. Thank you.
I guess, what is the percentage of the population of Berkeley that is Black at this point? You put the numbers all the time, but what's the percentage?
I believe it's 9%.
I don't think. 8%.
8%?
8% and 56% white.
And what is that, excuse me, what is that based on? Is that your 2010 census, or what is it based on? What is current?
That's
More current. It's more current than 2010.
Okay. What is it?
Survey. It's probably 2016.
2016?
I'm not sure about that, but it's, we try to use the most recent interim survey. So it's not a census, it's a random sampling, but it's pretty accurate.
I kind of feel it's less, so that's why I'd like to know where your statistics are coming from. So maybe I can get them.
Would it be accurate if that chart said, the same numbers be there if that chart said, related to non-compliance? Force related to non-compliance, would those numbers bear off the same?
No.
I don't think it can answer that.
I have kind of related, so in the area of like, let's try to think about it. So for me, force is always connected to an arrest or at times a 5150 commitment. And so I don't have sort of all the data on that, but I'd be curious. I think the question needs to be asked. Okay, if it's force, then we need to look at arrests, and we have the data on that. Figures about race and arrests, and then looking at within that, is force used in a disparate way in that context? And I think, but I don't have the recent force data. I think it sort of lines up there. I think that's an area that should be considered too, because really force is happening when there's an arrest or 5150 committal, which we should be able to track, and we should be able to look at are there disparate amounts of force given a percentage by race, X percent are arrested over this period, X percent different race, and then are there force disparities between those? I think that's an opportunity for us to look at that, and because we're about equity and identifying disparities, that is a lens we need to figure out how to look at.
So if I can for just a minute, I'll be brief and I'll jump on my soapbox just a little bit. And I'm not argumentative at all with the policing side of this because that's where I come from. But what we need to recognize is that when it comes to use of force, when it comes to arrest, if we want to change what the outcome is, right? If we want to change the dynamic of the outcome, we need to change the nature of the encounter and why we have the encounter in the first place. Right? Because it is a very valid point to say when you're in the process of arresting somebody and they become non-compliant, then force is used, right? And who's necessitating that force? And will we ever change that outcome if we continue down the same road? It really is a discussion if we want to change the outcome. What is the criteria for the interaction that takes place in the first place?
You mean the context of the arrest, for example?
No, I'm talking about why you're even interacting with this person in the beginning.
That's what I'm asking.
Right.
So, in some instances, an officer may be originating something. The officer makes an observation, takes action. In many, probably more instances, a person reports a crime. The officers are investigating based on that report. They end up contacting a suspect, and force ends up being used in that encounter.
I don't.
Going back further than that.
So I'll give you the example, right? When you write trespassing tickets, right? The population generally that you write trespassing tickets to, as you look across the country, are individuals suffering from homelessness, and they're in lower income neighborhoods that trespassing tickets are written, usually not on that person. And you look at the results of those tickets, result in use of force because there's some resistance that takes place. Now, the question becomes, right? Not is that a legitimate use of force when the person runs or the fight erupts. The question becomes, should we be writing trespassing tickets or jaywalking tickets at 3 a.m. in a neighborhood where there's nobody on the street? I mean, those are the difficult questions that we should as a society be asking ourselves if we want to change the outcome of this thing, right? Not that it's contingent upon necessarily the police to make these decisions for us, but should we have these laws on the books at all? I mean, these are the types of things that we should be looking at. Are we actually reducing the number of pedestrian accidents, right? Which I'm assuming, jaywalking tickets are designed to do. And so those are the difficult questions. And again, I don't know that I have the answers. So we certainly not found in the data, but that's the discussion that should be generated because then you can actually change that, right? If there's 10 uses of force that took place in the last year because resulting from a jaywalking interaction, if you no longer stop somebody or interact with jaywalking, you are not going to have those 10 uses of force. Now that's an oversimplification, but those are the types of things that we want to start thinking about if we're going to change what the finality is of this. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about a situation if the the officer claimed that someone was resisting arrest and their use of force, to determine whether the person really was resisting arrest. Have you found that body-worn cameras are useful in documenting what really happened? We haven't used them yet.
So you're getting outside the scope of our report. I have tremendous opinion on body cameras that I'm happy to answer. Let's finish this because I actually was involved in the major city chiefs in developing best practice policy for this, and Salt Lake City was one of the first in the nation to use them. So I have lots of opinions that I'll give you afterward. We'll let Kim finish. Oh, no, you're good.
Thank you. So 2 more slides. Thank you for hanging in there with me. I just wanted to lift up a few of the recommendations. There are 13 listed in the report, but the ones that I think are worth highlighting are the ones that have already come up, primarily around the data that is collected and shared. So a change in the use of force data, capture protocol to register every use of force, regardless of weapon use, injury, or complaint. We also suggested more details in the use of force data. So if there was a resisting arrest, how did that manifest? Collecting and sharing data on contraband so that we can do more yield rate analyses. And one also kind of personally looked it up was values-based evaluations of supervisors. So I know that Stockton PD has started including procedural justice tenets in their performance evaluations. So actually looking for positive instances where officers and supervisors have used voice, respect, neutrality, and lifting those up and actually evaluating and valuing them in the evaluation. So I'm sure that Chief Jones would be happy to share those with you. And then lastly, to highlight the steps that have already been taken by BPD, especially around the number of trainings that you sent us, proactively engaging in the post-bias-based policing training, crisis intervention training, tactical de-escalation, and I think there were about 7 or 8 more that you sent us on that list. And then, of course, the continued partnership with CPE and having these very difficult conversations with your staff, your community members, with us, and really just committing to facing down the data issues that you face here and that we are facing all over the U.S. and policing. So that's it. More questions? We'll go you and then.
Just a quick question is, with all the caveats about the law, is there an average or, when you're looking at all these agencies, what is the range talking about black-white disparities that are?
It's a comparative data.
You want to answer that? Yeah. Try to answer that. So I am not the scientist here, so we'll defer to the scientist when I go about. But what we are finding is, as we stated in the beginning, there's disparity in every agency that we look at. And those disparities are consistent with disparities that we would anticipate or have been studied in other areas, such as education, such as healthcare, and all those other things. And so, without a doubt, that there is a problem that exists, right? And what I don't think we want to wander down the road of saying that we are satisfied with where we're at. And so to look, and when Phil, our founder, said that Berkeley PD is actually in the bottom of what's going on, and thankfully so. And you absolutely want to be there. But there's still a lot of room to have the discussion about race and how that impacts the decision-making process of people and officers utilizing authority. Because there's no question, right, and we would be naive, I don't care who you are, where you fall on this issue, we would be naive to say that it doesn't have some sort of influence. And then, consequently, then how can we improve upon that? And it is not always, again, at that very difficult moment, some of it needs to be discussion about how we police, right? The expectation of policing in the country, right? We as the community, I would argue, as our founder has many times, like policing works exactly as designed, right? It's a system that we put in place. And if we're unhappy with the system, it's not a matter of changing necessarily the law enforcement, it's a matter of changing the system in the first place and what our expectation is of that system and the outcome. And so, going back to my point about jaywalking tickets, there is no question that force used against individuals in California for minor possession of marijuana has dropped dramatically. No question about it. You have changed that use of force in your community. Now, is that right? I mean, we can argue that all day and night, right? But it has changed that. And so those are the difficult discussions again. And I know I kind of danced a little bit around, and I'll pass it on here if there's a better way to answer how we compare across.
So I haven't looked at Berkeley in this comparative way, but apparently some members of our team have, and they are ranking Berkeley on the lower end with regard to these disparities. I will agree that remarkably, when you look across multiple agencies, so city police departments, highway patrol agencies, you consistently see what I think is the best marker of racial bias in law enforcement, which is a disparity in these yield rates. So when you look among those who are stopped and searched, what is the rate at which they're yielding weapons, contraband, or being arrested? You consistently see across many agencies that whites who are searched are more likely to yield drugs, weapons, and to be arrested, and even to be arrested in spite of the fact that they have a lower likelihood of having an outstanding warrant, which would be a trigger for an arrest. So we see that consistently. We see it in Berkeley. It's probably lower than we see in other places, but it's there. It's cause for concern. We also see, as Chris is indicating, that when you remove a lot of opportunity for discretionary contact between police officers and civilians, those disparities go down. So you see it in New York City with the diminishment of stop and frisk, which has gone down 98%, and the yield rates are getting much more equivalent than they were before. And that's purely by changing the system, by changing the incentives and radically changing the operations of the department. That's not going to be feasible in every place or with every manner of policing, but I guess, to come back to your original question, Berkeley appears to be doing better than most agencies, but it has work. It has work to do.
My name is George Levin, and I was formerly on the Police Review Commission and chair of the Fair and Impartial Policing Subcommittee that wrote the recent report. But speaking only for myself, an idea that we came up with was to examine data more closely that's available to us, specifically for stops, searches, and yield. And to get into a little deeper with an idea of understanding where are the disparities located. Are they located where on the bell curve, you might say, not as a statistician. Say, is it a disparity that spreads across the entire department? Or is it a disparity that is located in a subset? How small a subset? Can you drill down and find who the individuals are? If the department could do that, and it seems like not that complicated of a thing to do, then it seems that you would be able to decide if the problem was outliers, to use a term not intended to be disparaging, statistically speaking, or is it something that is spread across, then is it more a situation of an issue of policies, practices, and culture of the department? Would that not be a good next step that we already have enough data to embark on?
That is definitely doable. There's even a fairly well-developed procedure called doubly robust internal benchmarking, which is devised by researchers at RAND to look at just that sort of thing. Any human behavior is going to be somewhat normally distributed in a bell curve sort of way. Not everybody's going to be doing exactly the same thing, so expect to see some people on the lower end and some people on the upper end, and most of the people in the middle. And you have to parse what's causing people to be at the upper end. It may be that the officers at the upper end are assigned or given assignments or shifts that would cause them to be making more stops and searches, etc. So these are the things you have to dig deeper into the data to do. You might be looking for an abnormally distributed distribution, so where there would be a long tail of positive end of the distribution, and then you might start to worry that there are some bad apples, as they say, which is a term we should probably generally avoid. But so these are not mutually exclusive possibilities. The danger with this approach is that in focusing too much on the tails of the distribution, you don't pay enough attention to the center of the distribution. And my observation looking at multiple departments is that most departments, the center is off of where it ought to be, and the problem is more systemic. And so, again, they're not mutually exclusive. You can be looking for outliers, you can be looking for problematic actors, but you shouldn't do that at the exclusion of looking to see whether there's a systemic problem, which is generally the case.
I have a question, just follow up. When to look at the problematic actors, can you talk about what the evident outcomes or indicators of quote-unquote problematic actors tend to be? I'll use, for example, in the industry, the resisting arrest. We have an officer who's arresting lots of people for resisting arrest and nothing else. That's felt like, well, what's going on there? Because it seems to be this conflict on the crime. Can you talk about what expected negative outcomes or indicators you can see?
Right. Well, so one thing we would look for would be just to see whether the racial ratios are different for some set of officers. So if they, and then again, we need to look at where they're policing. So if you have an officer who's on a beat that's overwhelmingly African American, expect them to have a higher rate of stops and searches of African Americans. But you want to compare them to similarly situated officers. Now, I don't know if Berkeley's big enough to do a pretty robust analysis of that sort, but over, I think, 6 years of data, we could probably do something. The other thing is officers get their assignments changed and they rotate around. It gets complicated. I was thinking more in statistical terms that you would be looking for what we call a discontinuity in the distribution, that there's everybody kind of doing this, and then there are these guys out here. And why? And it could be based on racial disparities, but it could just be on rates of use of force or on rates of citations and arrests. We can look at all of those things. Again, I would just really caution that we not lose track of where the center is relative to where we want it to be.
So this body is anxiously awaiting your report, and it's certainly taken a while to go through it. And they really want to look at the outcome. Do we have a problem, and if so, how do we fix it? And so accuracy is incredibly important, but it seems like what's missing from the information is the contextual piece of who's, okay, so if certain groups are being stopped at higher rates or searched at higher rates or arrested at higher rates, well, how does that compare to groups, ethnic groups committing crime? And doesn't seem to be addressed at all in how you're drawing your conclusion. And so, to have accurate information to draw a conclusion, should not the contextual piece be there?
That's one of the biggest challenges of doing this work is that, again, it comes down to a benchmark. We don't actually know who's committing the crime. We have crime reports, but a lot of the crime reports are for crimes involving victims, and a lot of the discretionary policing is involving the victimless crime. So if we're interested in whether there are disparities in who's being stopped and searched for drugs in particular, then the crime rate benchmarks that we sometimes try to use are going to be pretty imprecise that way. That's why, again, I think looking at the yield rate disparities is really important, because that's where we can make a much stronger inference about whether there is bias either on the part of an individual officer or on the deployment or whatever's causing it that may be causing these disparities. And again, as Kim nicely described, if everybody who's being stopped has an equal probability of being in possession of drugs or weapons, regardless of their race or ethnicity, then you'd expect the yield rates to be the same across all of those who are being stopped. But it does appear in the Berkeley data and in every department I've ever seen that whites are being subjected to a higher threshold of suspiciousness in order to be searched. And that is not just a institutional systemic problem, that's a cultural problem that we have. It's completely consistent with everything I've seen from 100 years of psychological research. That people, police officers included, are trying to make an inference about what another person is doing, what they're up to, whether their behavior is suspicious or not. And they cannot help but be influenced by peripheral factors like race, gender, ethnicity, and the like. So it's not at all surprising to me when I see it in a police department. And the question is, what can be done about it? What kind of trainings can be done, and what kind of changes to the operations of the department can be done? So I know that's not an exact answer to your question, and the reason for that is that we don't have the data that we want to really know who is that denominator, who should be stopped, who should be searched. We can't say that. We don't have those data.
And controlling for the Part 1 crimes is an attempt to get close to that.
But we do
Three
have,
minutes here, just go ahead.
I have,
Go ahead.
I have a specific follow-up to this because focusing on the yield and just to orient people, figure 20, which is on page 40 of the report. This is what struck me. I mean, they talk about, you mentioned this difference in yield rate. And what I noticed was it doesn't appear that the difference in yield rate based on race for pedestrian stops is very different. It appears that for the low end, it's Asian Americans somewhere around 26 to 27%, and then kind of rising to whites. Some are still below 30%, and then other is slightly above 31%, but it doesn't seem to be that different. Whereas there's a huge disparity with respect to yield rate on pedestrian stops. On vehicle stops. What does that say to you? I'm just curious, what's the significance of having a disparity, I'm assuming it's the same officers, but having such a large disparity on vehicle stops and not seemingly having much of a disparity on pedestrian stops?
I can only speculate. I mean, I would say we have many fewer pedestrian stops in the data set by an order of magnitude or two. Fewer pedestrian stops. So that whenever you have fewer observations, you're going to have more volatility in the data. So I would have more confidence in the vehicle stop, which is in the hundreds of thousands. And so it raises a question. One, if these differences are real in terms of there being a disparity with vehicle stops and not with pedestrian stops, what is it about them that's different? But I think before we got there, we want to get a better sense of what's in the pedestrian stop data. There are some departments who, for one reason or another, are very vigorously recording every pedestrian contact. And I don't know what the case is in Berkeley, but vehicle stops are more likely to get reliably reported. So I think if we could have some confidence that the pedestrian stop data are representative of pedestrian stops, then there could be something really interesting in there, but I'm not ready to say what it is that differentiates those two. But I would again just emphasize that there are many, many more vehicle stops, and that I would have more confidence in that result because of that very reason.
I was just going to say, with regard to rates of crime, at least with regard to drug use, we do have very good data showing that drug use is basically similar across different races. We know that. So, and yet, there's vastly disparate arrests of people of color. And so, for that category, we can see crimes versus, arrests for those crimes.
Based on self-report survey data, it appears that drug use is similar across racial and ethnic categories.
Well, I just wanted to, it feels like when we think about where do we go, what's the next step kind of thing. And on the one hand, it feels like we could really get into the micro, and I think that it is important for us to improve our data management. I noticed that our open portal is about a year behind in the stop data. I think the last time it was updated was May of 2017. So we still haven't arrived at that place where we're able to stay current and manage the information. And I don't know, there had been some talk of having a data analyst whether that's an employee of the department or whether that's a city employee, but somebody who's really good at that. I think that would be super helpful. But we could bear down and identify individuals within the police department, but I don't think that's really where we want to go. We live in a town that has, I'm a school teacher. We have achievement gap in the school, big achievement gap. We have an achievement gap in employment, in housing. So across the board, so we have this, as you're mentioning, we have this giant dynamic, we call it racism rather than disparities. That's a historical legacy that we haven't gotten out from under. And so as we think about moving forward and we think about how many departments have to pitch in, and we think about the role of the police, in my mind the police should be a last resort. Because police are uniquely and specifically empowered to use force. So that should be last, but that's not what's really happening in our town. In our town, our police are spending a lot of time interacting with homeless people who are disproportionately people of color. They're spending a lot of time dealing with people who have untreated mental illness, and it's untreated, and they're disproportionately people of color. And it goes on from there. The underserved people are disproportionately people of color, and our police department, its mission has sort of expanded to be sort of the buffer. So if there's policymakers in the room, we have to look at that issue of, if we really want to get rid of disparities in the police department, we have to acknowledge and address directly the policy inadequacies in these other areas. And I really don't see how we're going, we can tinker with the machinery, but as you mentioned, there's fundamental changes that have to occur. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that our town, we're coming up with new policies for how to bust up a homeless encampment rather than how to provide, homes for folks. Not completely instead of. There's been some work, but it's not enough.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, that was a great discussion that took place at our convening meeting held last week. And the fact is that we have relied on police agencies, and it's become, like kids don't go to school. Well, you call the police. Really? Kids misbehave at school, so you take them out of school, and that's the best solution in order to give them an education and keep them going forward in school. We have this dynamic that takes place that, again, we rely on. It's the expectations we have for policing. And law enforcement officers, right? Your police are no different than any that I had worked for me in the 700 employees that I had. You send them out there, and your option is, when someone calls the police, you can let the person go, you can give them a citation, or you can arrest them and take them to jail. I want option number 4 that says, what are your underlying issues? Drugs, alcohol, mental health, housing, employment. Here's the department in the city that takes care of all that. I'm going to drive you there, and good luck to you. Right? But that's not how it works. And so our expectation as a community, right? I wandered around your city today all morning long and, interacted with some of your homeless populations, saw what was going on and everything else. When the business owner is fed up with the person standing outside panhandling and they call, the police can't very well say, no, we're not doing anything, see you later. Or when someone dials up the phone and says, there's 4 gang members that are dealing drugs outside my house. You can't say, well, no, ma'am, I'm sure those are just nice kids. Don't worry about it. Right? No, we send police officers, and that's already, right, a connotation of a negative interaction, because what did those 4 young men say? I was stopped because of the color of my skin. Right? We haven't even involved the police, right? Whether or not the officer has an opinion of that situation, we're sending them out there either way. And so it is a matter, and that's, brings us full circle around to the difficult discussions that we need to have in this country, because when we talk about disparity, right, the reason we refer to disparity is because it's a big jump for us now to say that disparities indicate bias or even racism, right? But there are differences there, and yes, those are factors in that, and we need to look and say, what is the underlying cause of that? That very well may be racism, right? But it also may be ignorance in how I deploy people. What my expectation is, if you send someone out and say, I want you to write license plate violations, right? The majority of white middle-class America that understands the law, registers their cars, has the means to do so, are not the ones you're going to be stopping. And so you're inserting disparity, and as an administrator, I might not have anything there. I just don't like people when they don't register their cars. I mean, those are the types of decisions that we as a society need to say, boy, what is it most important for these people standing back here in uniform to be doing on our behalf every single day when we send them out there?
I gotta jump in. Chris and I haven't spent much time together, let alone talking about the dynamics of Berkeley, but I think that our policing reflects our community values and a long legacy of exchanges that rely on treating people with respect, on the tenets that we have trained in procedural justice, but those are really affirmed dealing with people, treating them with respect and dignity, and giving them voice and so forth for a long time. And so I just need to sort of jump because of the outcomes. And I think that's what makes Berkeley a particularly unique place. And in spite of, I think, our focus on constitutional policing and respectful policing and developing a culture of de-escalation and a non-reliance on force, you know, if we're doing force in 1 out of 130 arrests, I think that's a very low amount of force. That reflects that. So I just want to sort of jump in.
No. I didn't mean to imply it was Berkeley on any, because I'm just talking more systemic across the nation. When I referred to that, I was not referring specific to anything Berkeley's doing or not doing.
Yeah, so moving forward, what do we expect from our relationship with CPE? Are you guys gonna do that? Are we gonna get another report? I know there's a lot more data that has to be collected, but how do you see our future going?
So we have a long-term MOU with your police department. We are continuing to collect your data. As the chief mentioned earlier, they are changing some of the things that they're doing in collecting the report data to address some of the recommendations that we're making. They've already begun doing some of those things, so we will continually collect that data and move forward with periodic reports back to the community.
Well, and as you heard, we just recently got partnership with Google who's doing some of our analytics for us. And so our hope is in the not too distant future, and we're saying in the next 2 years, that you will have a dashboard that decides that the analytics that you saw take place here can be run at the push of a button anytime you want to look at that. And so that's something that we're hopeful to accomplish in the next year or two.
And as Berkeley's data becomes more robust and we're able to collect more data, right now we give to every police department a data request document, and it lists all the things we'd like to see. We've never seen an agency that was able to give us everything we asked for. Berkeley's on the higher side, but there's still a lot that we'd like to be able to collect. You know, part of that problem is it would be really nice if there was a nationwide, this is what police departments will collect in their report, but there's nothing like that except for NIPERS that the Department of Justice said 18 years ago that every agency will be doing this in 3 years, and they've never followed through on any of it. Many agencies have already gone there. UCR is probably.
Thank you for your hard work, because I was introduced to your work when I went with the chief of police to the Department of Justice a couple of years ago when the COPS program still existed, and there was someone in the Department of Justice who actually believed in civil rights. But I mean, I want to go back to the recommendations because I think they're relevant and important. I have some questions that deal sort of with language, and just if you could expand on it. Because I think they're great recommendations. We talked about use of force, and that's something that Park Police Department uses now. All uses of reporting at all levels. I mean, I like your recommendation number 9, which is a crime trends with neighborhood demographics in order to ensure upward response rates. I think that's also an operational as well as perception dynamic. Operational, how using your assets, but also the community can actually see that not only you're policing it more, but you're also being responsive to their own crime needs, right? So I think that's a great recommendation. I don't know why you folks didn't include a recommendation that had to do with transparency in terms of reporting back to the community. BART has a process in which every single month they report on all uses of force, all arrests, all incidents, all internal affairs recommendations. I think that's part of the transparency in how do you change the dynamic of the department. So I didn't see a recommendation here, but I want to focus on number 12 and number 13. If you folks could expand, sorry, number 11. If you folks would expand on what do you expand on what you mean when you said possible influence in social dominance orientation? Because I think that's really important and key for everybody to hear. And in your reference on number 13, set up policies with clear accountability. So I always focus on language. Exactly what language is important as it reflects maybe that you saw, did not see, that needed to be addressed or expanded on. So if you could give us just a little bit of just a little information how you decided to write it that way, the social dominance orientation aspect of the mission, and the need to say clear accountability.
Which one of the reasons people want to take social dominance?
I have to say, I would just coincidentally, before I went to graduate school, I was a research assistant for a scientist named Felicia Prado, who was doing the original seminal work on social dominance orientation. And all I did was enter data into a computer in a closet. But I followed up on that over the years. And I've actually been urging that we go easy on the use of social dominance orientation, only because it's a fairly complex social psychological theory, and it takes explanation. And it doesn't surprise me that you're asking about it. The benefit of thinking in terms of social dominance orientation is that it is a theory and a measurable psychological construct that has been vetted very thoroughly over the last 25 or so years. So the research on social dominance orientation has been very thorough, and it's a pretty well defined and operationalized psychological construct, which essentially reflects the degree to which an individual person is comfortable with social hierarchies, or has a preference for social hierarchies. And it's predictive of all kinds of interesting outcomes and preferences for policies and behavior. So I think we are putting it in there. It's not my recommendation.
But it could be particularly more of interest in a parliamentary institution, which also has degrees of responsiveness and not the chain of command. So there's also there's a social structure that has to do with race, has to do with affluence or social status. And there's also another stratosphere that has to deal with how do you are with independent order. And if you are maybe a member of a police department in which your discretion is to apply the law, I mean, when you observe a transgression, there is a hierarchy there in terms of how you look at people as well. Is that part of the direct suggestion here in terms of the mission? And to look at that possibility of how that affects biases and possible interactions with people in the community, and to try to take that out so that there's a much cleaner, more transparent interactions and everything?
I don't know about cleaner and more transparent, but I think the general idea is to reorient people with power, like police officers, so that they're not so reliant on a sense of legitimate power and authority, but that they are more operating in more of a cooperative manner. And social dominance orientation is a way to measure that and identify people who may be at particular risk of that. And the accountability part is the part I'm a little more attached to, which is that another area of psychological research that has been carried out very systematically and thoroughly and had some very compelling, cohesive results is that on accountability. And one of the major findings, with a caveat that is important that I'll give, is that when people expect their decisions to be evaluated by somebody with authority, when they expect to be held accountable, their decisions are better overall. They're going to be held accountable by somebody who wants to see disparities or who wants to see highly aggressive. They're going to conform to that. And so that's how the values orientation and accountability have to go hand in hand. That's a finding across many domains, but I think it's especially relevant to policing. It's something that can be achieved when you have I have to say, at the convening last week, I was in the group that was talking about policing issues, and we were asked to state our values. And my value that I put forward was honesty, and so I see myself as an honest broker. And I said it's important to tell people what they need to hear, not necessarily what they want to hear. And Chief Greenwood said transparency. That was what he put out there on reporting that honestly as an honest broker. That's a value that Andrew Greenwood was willing to express in a room full of other police chiefs. So I think that's a good start. I'm not here to pump up BPD in particular, but I was really impressed with that, and I think it's a good start. And it's very important that authorities within the institution convey the values that they expect to hold their underlings accountable for, and that accountability is palpable.
But also to flesh it out, correct? Sure. Because you can say, and I believe the chief when he says transparency, but also then the dynamic is what does transparency looks like, and how is that a teachable aspect of how you train your police officers. And moreover, I mean, how transparent is the community with you about what their needs are. So I think it's a symbiotic kind of issue. So we are an oversight agency. The oversight agency has to have honesty and has transparency, and we have to be honest brokers. So I think when you're talking about how the police officers look at someone who they're going to be accountable for, they have to look at the oversight agency to be honest and transparent and impartial and not have biases. So because then it can become more accountable and diminishes that kind of sense of you're looking for the disparity or you're looking for the negative instead of looking for the positive. So I get it. So, thank you.
I have a question. Maybe I missed something, but the director had indicated that you're not receiving any money from the city or the police department. So what are the sources and who is financially supporting it?
So we are 501c3. We are attached with the Research Institute at John Jay. So.
Feel like we've really collected what we need.
Yeah,
I guess no one wants to get it.
We're passing it down to you.
I think it's both. I think it's both because they're recommending, there's some things you prioritized at the end. There's 13 here, but then you gave us a slide that said, this is really where we're focused. So it's really for both.
So the challenges for us are resources. What I want to say was a better word for that. Not just resources, but everything's going on. But to increase and add a couple more pieces of data to our stop data, I do want to just say the anecdote of being there, and I was speaking with one of their kind of senior data people, and my thought, was, man, it would be really good, kind of sooner rather than later, when we take a check on data, like what can we do, what more can we do, is for us to really get with their
profit corporations that make a lot of money off of police departments, and they're working with all of them with hundreds, even thousands of police departments, and getting them to include all of the data that we'd like to see in that. We don't have any control over that, but unfortunately, police departments don't have a lot of control over that either without giving away big bucks.
And we're doing exactly what they ought to be doing, and this would be wonderful to give them proof that that's what they're doing. But there are other, they can also show when they're not doing what they're doing. But I'd like to know what you have to say. I would love to know what you have to say.
So I'm assuming we're wrapped up on the rest of the stuff. I will briefly answer camera questions, and I'm happy to chat with you further.
Possible follow-up. Have you been doing this for long enough to observe communities responding to this and reducing disparities, and how did you do that?
We have. The simple answer is we've not been doing it long enough to look at that yet.
Maybe be the first.
Maybe.
Separately, I will say, as part of the former DOJ-funded National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice project, the Urban Institute, over the 4 years of that project, was doing community-based surveys to track attitudes, initiatives, partnerships with police departments involved in that project, and we'll be doing a follow-up at the end of the project to see how those attitudes and relationships are changing and combining surveys with stakeholder interviews. So soon there will be some data at least those 6 sites.
And those 6 sites, which are distributed around the country, are all in the National Justice Database as well, so we're going to be able to link with that.
Yeah.
So to answer the question about cameras, I'm an advocate for cameras in policing. I think they're a good thing. I think the challenge is the release and the privacy of the information that's contained therein, because there is a raging debate that, of course, we have not adequately addressed. I'm a firm believer that a police chief or a police agency is not the social conscience for society. And so the notion that something captured on those cameras is going to be salacious, is going to be, unflattering or anything else to someone else, should not be the basis as to whether or not my officers are protected or represented the way I believe they should be. And so that is up to society to make. I actually released a video of a young man being killed by one of my officers with